Good.
Hey, welcome in everybody. We're going to give a few minutes for folks to trickle in and then we'll get started. About 30 more seconds and then we will jump right in. Glad to see so many people joining. All right, let's jump in. So welcome to this webinar. We're going to talk about the Advocating for Equity Across All Levels of Governance guide, which is the newest part of the Alliance for Resource Equity Toolkit. So we're excited to spend some time with you. My name is Nicholas Munyon-Penny. I am the Assistant Director of P12 Policy here at the Education Trust. And then I'll turn it over to Shana, who's joining us as well. Let's introduce herself.
Great. Thanks, Nicholas, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shana Levitan. I'm a policy analyst at EdTrust.
So today we have a few main objectives. The first one is really to continue developing a common language, set of tools and action plans for advancing resource equity via the Alliance for Resource Equity. We really think it's important to have a unified vision of what resource equity really looks like, to make sure that we're able to advance our collective work around addressing inequities in our school system. In particular, we think it's really important to be expanding how we think about resource equity beyond funding, to look at other types of resources. We'll talk more about that throughout the presentation. Additionally, what we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about today is this new resource, Advocating for Equity Across All Levels of Government, or as we like to call it, Advocating Across Government for short. We'll really talk about how the tool can be used, how it fits into the larger context of the work, and then also I think give you some specific examples of how it can be used in your advocacy, looking at specific questions that can be answered using the guide. And then finally, as time allows, we're going to dig into looking at giving you a little bit of a high-level overview of the other pieces of the Alliance versus Equity toolkit and framework, so you can sort of see how this all situates in. And then we'll also have a couple of specific times dedicated for questions throughout the presentation. But if you have questions throughout, don't hesitate to put them in the chat or into the Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring both throughout, so feel free to just jump in with any questions you have throughout, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go along.
Great. So let's start to that first item around developing a common language around resource equity. I'm curious, when you hear the term resource equity, what comes to mind for you? So let's start by just getting on the same page by introducing resource equity, what it is and why it's important. And so take a moment and think to yourself, how would you answer this question? Feel free to drop some words or associations, reflections, and questions into the chat about resource equity. I'll give you a few moments here. Amazing. Full staffing in schools, absolutely. Other thoughts? What comes to mind for you when you hear resource equity? Comparable education experiences and opportunities for all students. That's great. Students getting what they need when they need it. I love that. Yes. So just resource equity is really about two things working together. It's about how much and how well, meaning schools obviously need money. It's that how much piece, right? But it's also how that money is being spent and distributed, which is that how well piece. That is also a fundamental consideration to promote equitable opportunities and outcomes for all students. I often find myself in conversation with advocates talking about what makes for strong student experiences in schools. And we're talking about things like strong school leadership or instruction that's engaging and effective and representative, or a racially diverse teacher workforce, positive school climate, things like that. All of these things require money, like a good chunk of money and investment. But obviously, that's not all there is to it. We can't just cut a check and call it a day. It comes down to resources, money, time, people, and how they're deployed, applied, and distributed within the district and across the districts to help that money kind of get it done.
And here's a way to really illustrate that point. So we can look at a few different pieces of data that are illustrated just to get a sense of what this looks like in practice. So if we're looking at maybe an example student from low-income background and a student that's from a more affluent family, looking at various pieces allow us to look at the whole picture. So when we're thinking about funding and staffing in particular, you can see here in just a second, that we can see just from looking at money alone and looking at staffing, we see that the student from low-income background might be in a school that has a little bit more money per student, and additionally extra staff across the building. But we're still seeing you can see at the very far right, large differences in proficiency within the schools that these students are attending. So it's really about looking beyond that initial piece of the number of staff and how much money per pupil students have access to get a sense of like what are the student experiences and where can we identify what's the source of the inequities here. So here's some examples of 4 specific things. So first, we can think about sort of teaching quality and diversity. We know, for example, from research that novice teachers, particularly those in their first few years of teaching, are generally less effective than more experienced teachers. We also know from research that teachers of color likely have higher expectations for students of color, and that can result in higher achievement. But in this school in particular, you'll see that the student from low-income background, where there are more teachers and more money, the student from low-income background is twice as likely to be in a class with a novice teacher that is likely less effective than a more experienced teacher. Similarly, when we're thinking about school leadership quality, we know that strong school leaders can help ensure, can be instructional leaders, make sure there's strong instruction in the classroom, can make sure that we're implementing initiatives thoughtfully and in alignment with best practices. And we also know that leaders of color can help, are more likely to hire teachers of color and increase the diversity of their teacher workforce. But that being said, when we look here, we again see that the student from low-income background is more likely to have a novice principal than one that is experienced and is more likely maybe to be leading the school to have more effective instruction. Similarly, when we're thinking about instructional content, we really want to ensure that all students have access to a curriculum that's aligned with standards, that there are high quality instructional materials that go along with that curriculum, that all students have high expectations for all students, that the content is really inclusive, and that all students are getting access to rigorous advanced coursework so that they're able to sort of meet the levels of standards and be ready for what comes after graduation. But we see it here that, again, the student from the low-income background is significantly less likely to be enrolled in advanced math classes, and potentially that's an additional source of why we see such large gaps in proficiency between math and the two different students. Finally, when we think about instructional time and attention, we really want to make sure that students are in class sizes that are small enough for students to have access to the resources they need and attention with teachers, as well as maybe additional time outside of the classroom to support additional needs based on how they're doing in the class. We'll see here that actually students from low-income background here actually have access to slightly smaller class sizes, and they have some extra time in reading, but no extra time in math, which is where we see that gap. So overall, we see that the students from the low-income background are significantly less likely to have the types of experiences across different areas of school quality that could be driving these inequities that we're seeing.
So how do we make sense of all of these factors that contribute to student experiences? EdTrust, in partnership with Education Resource Strategies, we've developed the Alliance for Resource Equity, obviously, which includes this framework that lays out 10 dimensions of resource equity that provide a foundation for understanding these key elements for more equitable school experiences for all children. And this framework is designed and intended for advocates and district leaders to work together to first identify and then begin to hone in on the right combination of supports, the right combination of dimensions to meet each child's unique needs. So it's meant for advocates and district leaders and systems and communities to work together with one another to meet the needs of every child in the district. So here are the 10 dimensions that we've laid out, and I'll give you a chance to look them over. So in addition to the framework, we've also developed a suite of tools to help districts and district level advocates push on resource equity. This toolkit has 4 sort of key elements to it. So the first is this anchor paper right at the top called the Education Combination, which introduces the framework and lays out what resource equity is, why it's important, and why these 10 dimensions. Next, we have a resource equity diagnostic that's intended to assess strengths and weaknesses across each dimension. It asks advocates and district leaders to pull relevant data sources and make some judgments about what they're seeing in these data sources. Next, there's a guidebook for each dimension. So 10 guidebooks total that's intended to dig deeper to consider underlying causes of challenges, some common root causes, I should say, and then some potential actions therein. And then now, we have a tool to help identify decision makers to determine who should be the target of our advocacy efforts. And this is where, as Nicholas mentioned before, we'll spend the majority of our time today demonstrating what this tool is, how to use it, and some use cases around it.
Awesome. So yes, the new resource advocating across all levels of government is really designed to identify the who. So who is the person that can sort of has the power to influence decisions that you're trying to make across whatever dimension of equity you're focusing on. Maybe it's multiple. Really just thinking about who is that decision maker. This piece of the toolkit is really designed to help spur action. Maybe you sort of know what it is you want to accomplish, but it can be really unclear who it is that actually can help you make that change happen on the ground. So this guide is really designed to sort of make that clear. In particular, I think it's important to note that many of the other pieces of the tools are really focused on the district level. But sometimes it's not someone at the district office or on the school board who can really help make the change that you're looking to see. It could be someone at the school level, it could be someone at the state level, it could be someone even at the federal level that really has the power to influence the inequities and address the inequities that you're seeing in your school system. So this guide really helps identify which level within the government you should be thinking about, and then also within that level who you should be talking to. So if you're thinking about the state level, it could be that you need to be talking to a state legislator to help advocate for additional funding for something you're looking for, or it could be You need to talk to someone at the Department of Education at your state, sort of get access to potential resources, guidance, professional development that could be implemented at your district. So it's really making sure that we're clear and sort of which level of government is important, and also who within that can help address the needs. So there are 10 guides. There's one for each dimension. So there's you can look at each specific part of the 10 dimensions, figure out which one is important to you for the specific action you're looking at, and then they'll go through each of the levels of government and what sort of their ability is to do. And additionally, there's a user guide that gives examples of specifically how you can use the tool, and we'll go over some of those today. I think what's really important to note here is that this is not really a particular tool that you would just sort of pick up and sort of just like read through and try to figure out at a broad level who you should be engaging when it comes to education advocacy. Instead, it really makes sense to have a specific sort of advocacy agenda, specific action problem you're trying to solve in mind already, and then figuring out which guide you should look at, and then determine from there some action steps, and we'll talk about that specifically. But I think the really important thing to emphasize is that it's really about enabling action you sort of may know what you need to do, but this sort of gets you to that next step of who is that person that can help you get it done, who has the levels of power that can actually get this work done, the levers of power to get this done. I think also important to note is that what we talked, like Shana talked about, this guide fits within sort of the larger ecosystem of the Alliance for Resource Equity tools. So we'll talk more about the other tools later in the webinar, but I think you can think about this as sort of like an extension of those once you've sort of gone through each of the steps. This is sort of the last step in the journey to think about sort of what now you can sort of do the action based on who you talk to. But additionally, if you already have sort of a set agenda in mind, if the group that you're working with, the people that you're working with sort of identify priorities already, you can sort of potentially skip those other pieces at one point and really just focus on this particular tool to help you identify specific people that you should be engaging around this work. Or maybe you come across a roadblock where one person who you thought was the right person is maybe stonewalling you, saying they can't help you. You can consult this guide to see who else might have the power to influence this decision as well. Maybe maybe it really isn't the person who says they can't help you, or maybe there's just someone else who can help you leverage that other actor. And so we'll spend some time thinking about that as we go through some examples. So really, to talk first about sort of like what are the steps to go through the tool, and these are what you'll see in the user's guide as well. Really first start by posing a who question. So thinking about who is it that can do whatever thing that you're trying to do. And then it's looking at sort of what is the dimension of resource equity among the 10 that is most aligned to that question. And in particular, there are also individual key questions within each dimension. And so you may want to look at sort of like, what is the specific key question that's most aligned to what I'm looking to talk about. You may also want to look at all key questions in the dimension if you aren't fully sure which one it is. Once you've figured out what dimension to look at, you'll then pick that specific advocating across government guide. Look for, you can either read through the entire thing or sort of skim through looking for keywords that are connected to your who question. And then once you've done that, looking at sort of what is available at each level of government, figure out sort of like based on that and the information you have, what are the appropriate action steps to take.
Great. So here's an example on how to use. It's pretty straightforward, but we'll walk you through it as with some examples. So let's imagine a scenario where advocates are focusing their attention on racially diversifying their district's workforce. And they're doing this because they know that a racially diverse teacher workforce has been linked consistently to positive student academic and non-academic outcomes for all students, but especially students of color. These advocates are very smart, and they also happen to know that districts around the country often report having trouble both recruiting and retaining high quality teachers of color. So this is where they've decided to dig in. So they'll start by determining the question, the who question, and there's several components here, right? There's retention, there's recruitment. For this, we'll just focus on retaining. So the question is, who can advocates engage with to ensure that their school system is providing the structures and supports necessary to retain teachers of color? Now that they've done that, identify which dimension of equity is most aligned to this question. In this case, it's dimension 2, teacher quality and diversity, and key question 2.3 to be very specific. So now we know where to look. So we'll consult the guides and we'll find reference to the question. And so the tool indicates that while state and federal leaders have, they have a role to play here, implementing practices that cultivate a good workplace environment at the school building level comes down to principals, and that helps teachers and teachers of color stay in the profession and in their classroom. State leaders also have that role to play around providing probing data or maybe best practice guidance around programs that have shown positive outputs and result in better retention among teachers of color. So then that helps inform appropriate action steps. Given that school leaders play a prominent role in creating these supportive school environments, I think it would make sense in this scenario to start there. Advocates could urge maybe some professional development or talk to the school principals around creating affinity groups within or across schools in the district.
So another example that we can be looking at is around student mental health. So we know in particular that mental health supports are really important right now as students spent long times outside of the classroom. In particular, students of color and students from low-income background were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and may need additional mental health supports to help them access instruction. So we're really need to be thinking about for this question, so who are the right people that we should be talking about to ensure that students that need health supports are being targeted for them? They're actually getting those folks, students who are most in need for mental health supports are getting access to them. So that's the question, who can help us to make sure that they're being targeted? So then we need to figure out which dimension that is. So you would do that again, remember, by insulting the education combination. Shayna dropped the link to that in the chat so you can take a look at it. For this particular question, we're thinking about student supports and interventions. In particular, question 7.2 talks specifically about mental health supports, so we know that that's the question we want to look at. So then we'll go to the advocating across government guide for dimension 7 around student supports and interventions. And there are some particular things that we can see there. So in particular, we see, if we look at the federal level, we see that the federal government can really, one of the main things they can do is issue guidance when it comes to how we should be targeting student supports. Another thing that we can see around targeting for student mental health supports is that at the state level, the legislature can provide funding or requirements around multi-tiered systems of support, which can help identify students in need of mental health supports. And additionally, the Department of Education at the state level could be providing professional development opportunities for districts to think about how to best target for students for mental health supports, as well as guidance. At the district level, just those folks can allocate resources. In particular, the school board can do that to provide additional supports or personnel around mental health supports. They can provide the PD, even including some that the state is offering, as well as facilitate partnerships with the community organizations. And then finally, at the school level, we see that school leaders, as well as educators and counselors, can be referring students or connecting students with the mental health supports they need and maintaining partnerships with community organizations. So with those various things in mind, we can really think about what comes next and what are the action steps. So likely, given that we saw that at the school level, it's really about that's where the referring to the mental health supports is really happening. That's where the targeting is really happening. It might make sense to start by connecting with school leaders or school counselors to better understand how these processes of identification work, so we can figure out how to advocate moving forward. It could be also worth looking at state guidance as well as sort of potential professional development opportunities that the state offers before you have those conversations, so you can go into those conversations armed with best practices and opportunities that the state, your school or district, should be engaging in on this work. And all those things you were able to see by consulting the guide. So that's another good example. Now we're going to spend some time letting you actually dig into this tool yourself with a few examples. So make sure that you've gone into the chat and you've clicked in both the links. That first link that Shayna put in is the education combination, which will help you think about the individual dimensions. And then the other link is to the actual landing page for each of the advocating across government guides.
Great. And just a note on some instructions of how this is going to work. We're going to put up a scenario and a who question. We are all going to look up the answers ourselves. But when you think you have the answer, you can load it up in the chat, but don't yet hit send. We're going to all do it at the same time and compare answers. So first we'll ask just which dimension does this best align to? And then we'll dig into the guidebook or the levels of government's tool itself. So research shows that targeted intensive tutoring should happen during the school day because it reduces potentially some barriers to access when there's targeted intensive tutoring happening before or after the school day. Not all students can access those services. So knowing that, who should advocates be asking to adjust the school schedule because we need to fit in that targeted intensive tutoring during the school day? So who can adjust that school schedule next year to accommodate tutoring? That's our who question. So take a moment, look through the education combination and figure out which dimension this would best align to. I'll give a few more seconds and then we can all put it in the chat. All right, go ahead. Which dimension does this question best align to? What do you think? Around scheduling and instruction time. Yes, instructional time and attention. Great, so that's dimension 5. Fabulous. All right, so now we know where to look, which tool to consult of the 10 guides. So shift tabs over to that and look through the instructional time and attention tool to find references to who can be adjusting the school schedule. We have about 30 more seconds. Again, keep looking for those references of who can be adjusting that school schedule during the day to accommodate tutoring. And go ahead and press enter. What do you think? School leaders, administrators, yep. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of responses at the more local level, right? The people that are close to the school building itself. Absolutely. So the tool indicates it's primarily school leaders. States and districts can issue guidance to school districts and leaders on school scheduling practices and maybe some considerations. States can also create competitive or maybe categorical grants, but it's really those inside the school building, the school leaders, the principals, the generally established school schedules, which would incorporate incorporating tutoring in the day. All right, great job. Let's do another example.
All right, so let's think about family engagement now. So we know that family engagement is first really critical to make sure that students, families, and educators are all working together to help support student needs. But to make family engagement effective, it really needs to be grounded in an asset-based mindset and be supported by professional development and training for educators so that they can actually do that work effectively. So the who question is here, is who should advocates be engaging to ensure that educators and school leaders have the necessary training that they need to effectively engage families. So who should we be looking at to be thinking about training for educators and school leaders? So first, let's take a second to look through the education combination, that first link that Shana put in the chat, and think about which dimension and potentially even which key question we want to be looking at for this particular dimension. So take about 30 seconds and look through that first one and get ready to send in the chat which dimension we should be looking at. All right, everyone go ahead and enter which dimension we should be thinking about. Positive inviting school climates, that's what I'm seeing across the dimensions. That is a good example. Which key question were we thinking about for this one? Yeah, so I would say positive inviting school climate is one. I was also looking at dimension 7 around student supports, around family supports. I think either one of them would provide you with information. So maybe you want to be looking at dimension 7 or maybe in dimension 6. Both of them talk about engaging with families and providing family supports. So the next thing we want to look at is sort of where do we see references to professional development and training for families? So take another, I would say, 30 to 60 seconds. Take a look, I would say maybe look at both dimensions 6 and 7 and see where you see references to training for educators. Now that we're taking some time to look at the Advocating Across Government guide, particularly looking at question 6.4 about family engagement, get ready to type into the chat sort of which actor has the most power to influence training for teachers. And in about 15 seconds, I'll have everyone send it in. All right, throw in your answer. Who can help ensure that folks are getting access to training when it comes to family engagement? Yeah, I'm seeing SCA and the school district. I'm seeing school district. Absolutely. I think we can see in the guide that the federal government can really potentially provide guidance about when it comes to professional development for family engagement, how to best engage families, but it's really the SEA who can require that professional development, make sure it's actually happening at the district and school level, and then it's actually district leaders that are likely actually providing the professional development for school leaders and educators. So then we want to really be thinking about, as we're thinking about creating an action step around here, we likely want to be talking to either the school district leader and say, hey, the state's requiring that you provide this professional development, you need to be requiring it. Here's some resources from the state. Or maybe your state doesn't require this type of training, and they should be. So maybe you're spending some time engaging with state legislators or even folks at the Department of Education to get them to be thinking about how they could be providing professional development opportunities, or even requiring it at the state level, so that you can really have some teeth to sort of make sure that it's happening at your district or your schools.
Great. So let's shift gears to our last example and practice opportunity, which is to say that it is I'm located in DC, and it is very hot, sweltering. And I can not imagine being in school when there's not proper ventilation or HVAC systems. And we know that this primarily disproportionately affects schools with high populations of students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. So if this is something that is affecting your district, who should advocates be engaging with to ensure that there's funding for building maintenance and upgrades that are getting to the schools that need it the most in terms of HVAC or ventilation and facilities budgeting? So take a moment and think about, with education combination, what dimension does this align to best? I love it. All caps, learning ready facilities. That's exactly right. And so there we go. We know where to look. Consult the tool now. Where do we see references to the distribution of facilities funding? Which key question? And then within that, who is the actor or actors that could have some key influence over this? So take 30 to 60 seconds, consult that guide for Dimension 9. And let's go ahead and drop in the chat who could be a target of your advocacy and engagement. I'm seeing answers around school boards, district administrators, state legislators. So we're kind of spanning the gamut here. Any other thoughts? I think these are all right. The guide talks about how the state departments of education have a huge role to play here. They're the ones that ensure that facilities funding is provided and equitably distributed. And they're also the ones in charge of collecting data on the conditions. But that's not to say that there isn't work around advocacy and engagement at the local level too, right? We know that school boards hold significant power in terms of budgeting, and they're also responsible for soliciting input on community need. So in terms of thinking about an action step, I think all levels would be helpful, but certainly engaging school boards to talk about how this is impacting the community and the community need across which schools specifically in the district. And then also consulting the resources that the SEA puts out around budgeting and rollout there. So we just threw a lot at you, and I know there are lots of questions in the chat. So we just want to take a moment to step back and answer some of those questions that are in the chat, and then additional questions as well. So take a moment, think about what you've heard, what you've practiced with these examples, and let us know what's on your mind.
So Lisa, you asked the question about sort of who is the target of these guys, sort of who's our general audience. I would say, I'm put this in the chat, but I'll voice it out loud as well. We're really thinking about this pretty broadly in terms of advocates. Generally speaking, the ARE tools in the toolkit are directed particularly at folks that are working at the district level. So community-based advocacy organizations are really the target audience more generally, but this tool in particular, we think could be utilized by a wider array of advocacy organizations, particularly maybe those at the state level, who may be frustrated that they're not being able to get the work done at the state level, and they may need to be sort of directing their advocacy up towards the federal government, or maybe down towards the district or school level, and this guide can help guide that information for advocates too. Lisa, there's another good question about teachers unions. We didn't talk specifically about teachers unions as a part of this work. We sort of focused on sort of the more official levels of government, being sort of the school district administrators or school boards. But I do think it could be very useful, particularly for advocates to be thinking about if they want to sort of get a sort of groundswell of support. It could be worth engaging with unions both to gather support for your ideas, as well as they also are very powerful lobbying force and can help get your points across to folks at school level, district level, etc. And even potentially at the state level, they can be very useful in sort of mobilizing grassroots efforts on these things. We haven't conducted trainings for unions, but we would love to. And Demetrius, at the end of the session, we are going to pop into there'll be a link to a form that you can fill out to get more information. So definitely put your name and contact information when we get to that point. And we'd love to talk with you about talking to your union about this work. Any other questions that we have right now? If not, feel free to continue popping them in the chat as we go along. Otherwise, we're going to take the next 15-ish minutes to talk about some of the other resources that are connected to the ARE toolkit, so you can sort of see how this advocating across government tool fits into the larger ecosystem of the ARE tools.
Great. So as Nicholas just said, we're going to kind of almost hit rewind in a sense. So in the beginning, at the top of the call, we shared about the other resources and how to use them all in conjunction with one another, and how to use them in discrete ways, especially this most recent tool to answer a specific question. And so now we're just going to take a moment to talk about these tools more specifically. So the first one is this education combination. I like to think of this as kind of an anchor paper that draws on the research and lived experiences of students, parents, and educators, and breaks down what resource equity is, why it's important, and how to think about a framework behind it. And so it goes through each dimension of the 10 with these key questions that we were referencing, and gives some information around the importance of each key question specifically. This is a really great primer to start off with, and also to refer back to at times, as we showed with referring back to what question what dimension your question aligns with. And it's a helpful place to orient yourself or reorient yourself to resource equity on the whole.
The next piece of the ARE toolkit is the diagnostic tool. This is really where users of the toolkit, whether it be folks at the district, on the district side, or with advocates, is really digging into the data that exists at the local level and using it to identify both strengths and inequities within your system, and identifying priorities that should be sort of like the focus of your advocacy moving forward. So how this works is that there is a diagnostic tool for each of the dimensions, or talks about each of the dimensions, and there's within each key question, there are specific considerations and questions that you should be asking yourself, and the questions themselves will typically guide you to the specific data that you should be looking at as a part of this work. Some of this data might be publicly available for advocates to use. Some of it you may need to potentially try to ask districts to share that information with you, or you might just have to use what's publicly available. And additionally, I think it's really important as you're thinking about doing this diagnostic is to engage with students and families that are in your community, sort of get their perspective on these things. It's not all the questions don't talk about hard data, but also sometimes talk about individual student experiences across schools. So as we think about this how this works, there are sort of two pieces that we look at in each dimension, both the foundations for excellence, what we want to see for all students when it comes to each dimension and each key question, and as well as equitable access. So are students at different schools and different, or even in different classrooms, experiencing school climate in this case in very different ways. And like I mentioned, the questions really direct you to the data that you want to be looking at. For instance, there's a question around sort of what are the district's rates of office discipline referrals, suspension, expulsions. Like that's pretty self-explanatory. You can sort of figure out sort of what are the rates. But then on the other side, there's a question around sort of to what extent are discipline policies and practices implemented consistently and fairly for all students in our district. So you might be looking at disaggregated data in that case, if it's available to you, as well as talking to individual students, educators, families about the things that they've experienced in their school system to help identify what the priorities are. When thinking about this work, it can make a lot of sense to sort of start by looking at one dimension that's already connected to one of your sort of maybe key advocacy asks that you've sort of already identified in the work that you're doing. And then expanding into other dimensions as well. Ideally, we think it's important to sort of do this work across all 10 dimensions to fully understand where inequities are, think about how these dimensions interact with each other, and identify priorities.
So then we have the resource equity guidebooks, right? So we've laid out resource equity, what it is, why it's important, and some framework considerations of how to make sense of it. Then the diagnostic is helping advocates and district leaders conduct a needs assessment, gap analysis with the potential data sources that's available publicly or by asking the district. And now we want to probe some underlying causes of challenges by considering to consider ways to improve student experiences in school. So this is broken up into 3 sections, and there's a guidebook for each dimension. So 10 guidebooks on the whole, each organized in the same way in the same 3 sections. This is just an example of the positive and inviting school climate dimension. So the first section is to help determine root causes. So this includes prompts to help sort of narrow that focus from a menu of common root causes that that might be occurring in your district. And then maybe there aren't, this isn't an exhaustive list. So there's also a place for you to slot in some potential other root cause that you might be curious about that could be contributing to some inequities in your district. And so there's a way to sort of select the ones that you think might be most significant or relevant or true for what's driving your district's challenges. And this is really to be a way, it's intended for your team to think and discuss and keep probing the why question with the data that's at hand to dig deeper. The next section of these guidebooks is to explore potential actions based on those potential root causes. So there's some additional guiding questions to choose what might feel the most promising given what you know or believe to be true about a potential root cause. And for each action, it's helpful to consider if this action needs to occur sort of system-wide or within specific schools in the district, or perhaps it's both. So it asks you to consider that as well. And then lastly, the guidebook prompts next steps. So it asks you some guiding questions around timing, so short-term versus long-term actions and prioritization of getting it done. So I'll show you what I mean. So here we have just an example of some of the guiding questions around root causes. Consider some potential data sources and some additional input from stakeholder groups in your community. Ask you to consider how biases might be playing out in your district, either explicit or implicit. And then on the right-hand side is an example of some of the menu of options that could be potential root causes. And then just showing you an example of what the potential actions might look like for each key question within a dimension for each guidebook. And so it asks you to consider which one might make the most sense and how to balance a lot of these actions too, right? So there's some technical solutions or actions. These might have to do with changing a policy or a schedule, something more discrete. That's the purple highlight or box. And then there's also adaptive actions that advocates can take as well. So this is targeting potential changes in behaviors or attitude, a suggestion on a different strategy on engagement or capacity. So these are just some screenshots within the guidebooks.
And then again, just as a reminder, the final piece of the toolkit is what we've been talking about this whole time. This is really about taking what you've learned, identifying those action steps, those root causes and action steps, and then figuring out who is the person that you should be talking to make those things that need to be happening and happen. The action steps in the guidebooks really focus on district actions, but you could identify as through your work that there's potentially other people, like we mentioned, that could need to be pulling some levers to help incentivize, require, or support district action in this work. And then additionally, beyond sort of the core 4 pieces of the toolkit, there are a couple other things that I think are really important to look at on the site as well. There's an advocate's guide that sort of talks a little bit in depth about sort of the various pieces of the toolkit, give you sort of a sense of sort of how to do this work. And then additionally, we have this really awesome sample meeting agenda. There's a lot of value in doing this work as advocates on your own, but there's maybe even additional value of doing this work collaboratively with district leaders, so that you're actually able to be thinking, co-creating these solutions together. And the sample meeting agenda helps advocates potentially come to the table with a frame and how to do this and guide you through sort of a day-long or half a day-long meeting with district leaders to sort of talk about resource equity with the folks at your district. So it's a really great resource as well. That's sort of a supplement to the main pieces that are worth looking at.
Great. That is what we have for you today. We're also happy to answer some of these additional questions that were popped into the chat. But all of these resources and things that we mentioned or previously linked are available on our website. So this is where you can find it. And also our monthly newsletter. Encourage you to hit that subscribe button that kind of circulates resources both internal to EdTrust as well as education resource strategies, and then also resources across the fields that we're aware of that can help push on specific resource equity considerations and resources. So here's where you can find all of that. And then lastly, we would love for you to fill out a short survey about this webinar. And so here is the link. I will also pop it into the chat to get your feedback on how today went and ways we can improve to make this tool useful for all of your good work.
And as I mentioned at the end of the survey is also a spot for you to put your contact information if you'd like to learn more about the Alliance of Resource Equity, as well as sort of the tools and how they could be leveraged within your community. We'd love to connect and talk with you about how we can support your work. So we have a few minutes left, so we'll just go off, give you a couple minutes to add any other additional questions you might have, or fill out the survey for us. So thanks. We'll stay on for a couple of minutes to answer any additional questions folks have. All right, everyone, thanks again for coming and have a great rest of your day.